complete coincidence, actually.
Yeah. Can they see your logo?
That was major coincidence.
Well, what can I say? WNPS being, I suppose, one of the foremost non-governmental authority, well, conservation entities on the island, it does have quite a large reach, should we say?
I would say so. All right, shall we then start anyway?
Yeah, let's do it.
Hopefully through. So do you want to introduce this section?
Yeah, so today's live session concerns the protected areas in the east of the island. We refer to them as Sri Lanka's eastern terrestrial protected areas, which you can see on the map that Riahn has up there. It actually stretches all the way from Lahugala Kitulana National Park in the south, right the way to the proposed Pankulam Northern Block protected area in the north. So it's quite a big chunk. And we've also added in the protected areas that formulate the Gal Oya Forest Complex, which is also another significant protected area cluster on the island. There's multiple protected areas in that area. It's not just Gal Oya Valley National Park, but we'll get more into that.
And what I find interesting is there's so much coverage in this area, but it's probably the least known of all the areas that we'll be covering.
You'd be driving across to the east coast without even realizing you're cutting across half the
Yeah, exactly. There's so many protected areas in this zone, and people use it to get to the east coast, but hardly spoken about compared to the earlier session, which was Yala.
Absolutely.
All right, so we'll start with Lahugala Kitulana, because that's where we stopped at Kumana really last week, and we can move into Lahugala, which is probably the closest zone. So do you want, while I give it on the map, do you want to go through upwards and then we can go into detail?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So on Riahn's map, you will see the protected area that we're starting with in the southernmost quadrant of this area is the small, but not the smallest. There's a very common misconception about Lahugala Kitulana National Park. Everybody thinks of it as the island's smallest national park, when actually it's not. The most updated gazettes for Lahugala Kitulana National Park give its area at 51 square kilometers. So it's actually relatively big, all things considered. And then we move further north via Bakmitiawa Tibirigola, which is a 474 square kilometer national reserve forest, which then connects directly to the Gal Oya Forest Complex. Now, the Gal Oya Forest Complex is an interesting one because it comprises not just Gal Oya Valley National Park, as I mentioned earlier, but a number of wildlife sanctuaries. I guess the most well-known one indirectly would be the Senanayaka Samudra Wildlife Sanctuary, which, for Gal Oya National Park, a lot of people end up going on boat safaris in the Senanayaka Samudra Wildlife Sanctuary. And then surrounding the park itself, you have the Gal Oya Valley Wildlife Sanctuaries, northwest and southeast, that's Ampara and Sellakoya respectively. And you also have the Buddhangala Sanctuary on the very end. Then as we move further north, you have the Moneragala National Reserve Forest, which is an enormous 2-block chunk protected area. And that's an interesting one, because again, everybody assumes that Yala National Park is our second largest protected area, when actually when it comes down to it, Moneragala stands at 1,000 square kilometers. Yala National Park
that's the other important thing that we probably can touch on from this zone.
Yeah.
The fact that there's so much coverage, but only 5 national parks. Everything else falls under other protected areas, showing the importance of the other protected areas outside the national parks, which is what we've been trying to share through these live sessions.
Absolutely. And then as we go further across Moneragala, we get to Toppigala, also known as Barron's Cap or Kudumbilai, which is another 294 square kilometer protected area. Lots of terrestrial Big 5 sightings supposedly in that area. And then we move on to the Mahaveli region, specifically Somawatia National Park, the Trikonamadu Nature Reserve, and the multiple DFC protected areas in that big cluster you can see on the map. And then we move further north to the proposed Pankulam Northern Block and Kantale, which is divided there on the eastern provincial boundary lines, which contains another 600 square kilometers worth of pristine habitat. And that in itself contains enormous, incredible populations of wild elephants. So it's quite a significant chunk. We've actually left out Wastamo National Park and that area for the North Central episode, which we will do subsequently. But for the moment, we will just focus on the areas that I mentioned prior.
Yeah, so exactly. And from that, you can see how much coverage, like I was saying earlier, but still it's less spoken about. So this is probably our best opportunity to share and create that importance of the protected areas outside national parks. And the 5 national parks in this area, which we did show you all on the map, starting from Lahugala in the south to Gal Oya Valley, then Madhur Oya, then Somavatiya, and then Horapatana, which is one of the smaller ones in this zone. So there are 5, but outside that, everything else, all that coverage is actually other protected areas, which are not national park, showing that importance for the national parks, the protected areas around them, especially for wildlife enthusiasts. This is a great opportunity to throw out there the importance of these other protected areas, and that is the whole purpose behind these sessions.
Yeah, and not just that. I mean, keep in mind that a lot of these other protected area types, just so for those who are interested that they're aware, these protected areas include national reserved forests, of which there are 34. Then we have 8 wildlife sanctuaries, 1 nature reserve, 1 forest corridor, and another 18 proposed reserves. So, as Riahn said, it's important to place emphasis on how connectivity ensures that wildlife conservation is a success.
Yeah.
Because
just
without
to add on to that
connectivity, we
point,
lose a lot. Yeah.
Just to add on to that point, there's 68 protected areas. That's 50 proposed and 18 proposed and 50 that are in place. And out of that, only the 5 being national parks. So everything else is other protected areas. And here is one place where we can see the actual effect of corridors, and you can see the connection on the map itself. If you look at this, between Gal Oya and all of that, one sec, you can see all these connections quite clearly. They are disrupted, but you can actually see the effect and how there is movement happening upwards, which you would be very aware of. From down here, even there's movement happening upwards of animals.
And what's interesting is, let's take an example of wildlife such as a sloth bear or elephant even. An elephant could actually go from the Great Yala complex below this chunk through this network of protected areas and go right the way north via the protected area.
So from, you're saying from down here,
from
through
down
these,
there,
up, yeah.
through that network and right up to the north. It's actually quite a significant chunk of wilderness.
Yeah, that in itself shows the importance of these connections, and there being that allowance. So that, what would it be? The connection being important, it's more the fact that our human activities allow it to happen.
I know.
And how our road networks, like we were talking about in the earlier session, how they do not disrupt as much. And in this area, like we said, we use these roads to get to the East Coast mainly, and we're driving through these protected areas. But the planning here, I would say, is okay, but there's a lot more to be done. And also the other factor is the encroachment factor.
Yeah, absolutely.
And would you because you've been working more in the East recently, do you want to talk about the encroachment factor and maybe some of the effects that it's having on these protected areas?
So if we start with a quick example such as Lahugala Kitulana, what's interesting is that there is an A-class road. The A4 cuts directly across this national park. Now, what it does mean is that when people go to the East Coast, and even people who head to Kumana, a lot of wildlife enthusiasts don't even realize they're actually cutting across a national park. And this also has an undesirable side effect in the sense, I would say, is that there is a lot more roadkill and a lot more examples of human-wildlife collisions. I've actually seen several instances where we've had 3-wheelers that have been toppled over by wild elephants that have got annoyed. We have examples of vehicles that have actually gone completely off the road because they've swerved to avoid wildlife at night. And in general, it means that there is a general loss of connectivity. So it is important for any management plan in any protected area that any A or B class road that cuts across these protected areas is taken into significant account. Because if we don't take this into account, it actually creates more problems than it solves, which I'm sure you can agree with very well.
No, exactly. That definitely, I would say the way you explained it really gives it clarity, because these A-class roads are so traveled upon and the East Coast is a very popular destination. These roads are used, and like you said, people don't realize that they are driving through protected areas. So that in itself is a bit of a problem, because there should be more awareness. And when you do drive across these areas, there needs to be more careful, and all of those things need to come into effect. So while the planning is important, creating that awareness while you're going through these areas is more important, I would say, because now the roads are in place and we have to deal with that. So it's more about creating awareness for travelers in these areas, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And just to actually add on to that point, awareness is a big thing here. I don't know whether many people know about this, but Somawathiya National Park, which is in this general cluster, is actually our 6th largest national park. But it's also one that has suffered quite considerably at the hands of multiple environmental crimes. We have illegal sand mining, deforestation, loss of riverine forests, encroachment, antiquated agricultural techniques, even the seizure of DWC assets within Somawathiya National Park. So one thing I would say is that if anybody's to learn anything from these sessions, is just to be aware that certain protected areas are being leveled at a critical rate. And the only way that we can stop that is that we spread awareness and get the government to realize that these protected areas mean as much to us as it means to them. So I think even for protected areas, for example, such as Trikonamadu, which is another big nature reserve that adjoins Somawathiya, there should be a lot more done to potentially allow visitation into said areas. And that way we can utilize these protected areas in a more efficient manner, which I'm sure you can agree with as well.
No, that's 100% true. And again, it comes down to the involvement of the government and all of that in the planning process and how things are done. But what is already, that was the point I was trying to make. What is already in place, it's more about how the management of it happens and getting people involved in proper management. So I would say the scientific research is important to figure out where the most prominent corridors should happen and where there is crossing happening more regularly than others. But that again is very difficult because you can't really plan for those things because wildlife has a mind of their own and they are free to do whatever they want because technically the road is cutting across their home. And we should be more aware for them, but in the end, the humans are the more important. I'm trying to put this in the right way. The more important consideration for governments are the human aspect. So they do have to plan more for the humans. So coming up with corridors in the correct areas and not having a big impact on these protected areas is more important. So the management is what I would say.
And tying into management, I think we should also stress that a lot of the protected areas here, actually for the majority part, are Department of Forest Conservation protected areas. And one of the secondary dual mandates, I don't know whether many people are aware of this, that the Department of Forest Conservation has, is the sustainable use of resources for the purposes of community-based development. So if we were to look at a potential solution for a lot of these Department of Forest Conservation protected areas, instead of wiping them out completely, why don't we push the government to implement these policies and get local communities to act as secondary caretakers? Because unfortunately, the Department of Forest Conservation for the majority of these protected areas can't do it themselves. At least for the Department of Wildlife Conservation, the regulations and the standards are in place that if something goes wrong, in theory, if there's no political intervention, you can get a legal case in your favor to ensure that the protected areas remain intact. But with the Department of Forest Conservation, things have always been a little more gray, as Riahn will know very well. So
that's why explaining these things, you have to be careful with the way you explain it. And also, again, that ties into the management, how you introduce or how you involve these communities. Because, again, you can't then involve everyone as such. So that, again, comes down to management. So the right management, more than just overall management, the right management and putting the right practices into use is more important than anything else.
Yeah, and also if we combine ecotourism and sustainable resource use, we can actually get a pretty effective management plan in place to ensure that protected areas remain intact.
And that's the other thing with this eastern zone. There's a lot more of the human encroachment and poaching and all of that happening, but it's not as spoken about because of the lack of awareness in this zone. And the deforestation, if you want to talk about that now while we're on that topic.
Yes, so unfortunately, the deforestation in this area has been quite rampant over the years. I think partially due to the fact that the East, for the most part, has been quite a lawless part of the country. The Civil War affected a lot of people, there's a lot of poverty, and there is a general demand for resources. So for example, the protected area that I mentioned earlier, Moneragala, the second largest protected area on the island, that, when looking at it from a practical on-the-ground standpoint, I would say not more than 500 square kilometers of the original 1,000 square kilometers still remains. Even protected areas slightly further north, such as Chundangkadu. Chundangkadu is a protected area with 2 blocks. National parks aren't the only protected areas that have blocks, like Yala. And block 2 of Chundangkadu has been pretty much wiped out, whether it be due to external intervention or just general need for land. And that in itself is an example of how badly deforestation can hit these protected areas and what we are working to try and prevent.
Yeah, exactly. So that shows, and especially like you said, while the DWC has those laws and you can take people to court about it, the DFC management style and all of that does need to be probably changed to give that extra bit of protection, is what I would be thinking is a probable proposal that can be given. And the way to think about it is probably now the best time while everything is shut off and everyone in Colombo can work to help all the conservationists. And that's the other thing, creating that togetherness, because none of this can be done overnight and no one can do it alone. I think it's more important that all of us come together, and all the non-government organizations, like we were talking about in the start of the chat, come together. And there is that, because we're all in the end trying to get to an end goal that is common to all, yeah. But unfortunately, everyone's using their own parts, and maybe finding a way of bringing those parts together is another important aspect.
Absolutely. Cross non-governmental entity cooperation is exactly what we need. And because it also helps. When we are united, we can provide a model by which the DWC and DFC specifically can also unite to achieve a common goal. There's a big example. If you show them on the map, Riahn, the one I wanted to talk about earlier.
Let me get the map up for you.
Yeah. So Trincomalee Naval Headworks, that's a 182 square kilometer wildlife sanctuary in the general vicinity of Trincomalee town. But there's a small problem, you see, because if you zoom in, you can actually see the area around Trincomalee Naval Headworks is actually a DFC protected area. So there's quite a bit of bureaucratic back and forth, and nobody actually knows whether Trincomalee Naval Headworks takes precedence or Kantale, the National Reserve Forest there, takes precedence. And in that sense, if we were to promote unity amongst our environmental organizations, I think that's something we could work towards for the government entities as well, at least in theory.
Exactly, and that gives a really clear example, because there is that overlap, and then there's the fighting for borders, whereas it's all for the common goal. So maybe coming together and, like you said, creating one, it's all in the end for conservation. So that should be the main aim, not the fact that you can what? I need to be careful with the way I say these. Laying claim as such.
Yeah.
Well,
no, you're right. Right.
Yeah?
Because you see, the thing is, government entities shouldn't have a competition, especially in the conservation, wildlife conservation and protected area spheres, over who gets access to what. That just creates unnecessary boundaries, and unnecessary borders are physically implemented. That prevents wildlife movement, and that goes against what we are trying to do anyway.
That's another thing you do see. These borders coming in, electric fences and all of that. But that in itself inhibits the movement of animals. While there is the human-animal conflict, putting in fences is not the answer, because you and I know how easy animals get through these fences. But it's more, I think, the way of laying claim as such to these different areas by putting in these fences, and not to really inhibit the movement of animals through these protected areas.
And that ties in again to something else I've been wanting to actually mention, which is the law component of this. So for example, Riahn, if you go back to the map, and we can just show them an example of where law itself has been almost forgotten as time moves on, but is still an important component of what it means to have protected areas in action. So zoom into Gal Oya Valley National Park. Now, the thing about Gal Oya National Park, as everybody refers to it now, is that it was originally gazetted, and I can send anybody who's interested can message me later and I can send them the gazette. The gazette for this specifies the area as Gal Oya Valley National Park. That is the original name of this national park. So one thing I think people need to have a slightly better understanding of is how the laws work and how gazettes officially specify that protected areas physically on the ground exist. Without an official gazette, it's worthless. Which, I mean,
exactly. That's where lots of these proposals also, we need enough backing to push them through, because I think that's where the togetherness comes again into effect, because to put these proposals through, you need that backing, where you need a group of people, not just one or two individuals shouting for it as such, whereas together we can get these things done. And also, moving to this Gal Oya area, we can talk that the national park is only 259 square kilometers, whereas this whole thing, then the importance of everything outside the national park comes into effect.
Yeah, because truth be told, without the other protected areas, there's a good chance that Gal Oya Valley National Park would collapse ecologically. It needs these protected areas, not just to buffer the national park, but to also allow the wildlife that lives in Gal Oya Valley National Park to enter, the southwest and northeastern wildlife sanctuaries, Budangala, the Nelugala Forest Corridor. All that creates connectivity, going back to what we said earlier. And, it would be a shame to lose these, because now Gal Oya National Park is 259 square kilometers. Directly north of that, almost, Madre National Park is 558 square kilometers. Sorry, 88 square kilometers. That's our fourth largest national park. So it would be a shame to lose these.
Exactly. And that ties into the need for the protection of these areas, and also the need for the protection of everything outside national parks, and getting our mindset away from just national parks, which is one of the reasons we did start this, and promoting the awareness of all protected areas.
Absolutely.
So, like we were saying earlier, this zone really does elaborate that importance. But you see all these illegal activities also happening, which is another sad aspect. But then again, it comes down to the management. So coming up with a proper management plan.
But it is a shame, though, because, for example, if you zoom into Pankulam, which we were talking about earlier, that northern block proposed reserve that I mentioned, that in itself, during the island-wide blanket police curfew, last month on the 22nd of April, the Pankulam Northern Block proposed reserve lost 40 acres worth of dry zone dry evergreen forest. Multiple trees were lost, multiple different species. And they had found several burned carcasses, which didn't actually make the news, which I got to learn of later, of examples of wildlife. So again, when you say a proposed protected area, it is vital that we work with the government entities that handle these protected areas to get them gazetted ASAP, because otherwise people can get...
That's why I was saying again, it's more about that togetherness, because you can't just push it through without that backing. And you need as much as you can, because the way our government listens to things is probably more when there is a louder voice. So that's why by creating awareness and talking about these things and getting more people involved is probably key.
Yeah.
What would you think on that factor?
No, absolutely. Community participation has always been one of the fundamentals of ensuring that protected areas actually remain physically on the ground instead of being wiped off the face of the earth. And in that respect, we should actually work, we are wildlife conservationists and, people who enjoy protected areas, but creating a great degree of awareness for the general public is also a vital component of this.
And exactly, that's where again ties back to the fact that this area is probably the lesser known area in terms of protected areas, because it's more a through road for the East Coast than protected areas in general. Even the national parks probably the least visited in the whole island.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think, for example, even north of Trincomalee town, say you're going to if you're going to the beach at Nila Valley or Upper Valley and you're going to go for a weekend. If you are a wildlife enthusiast who wants to get out there and explore a new protected area, north of Trincomalee town, you have Trincomalee Naval Headworks, you have Tannan Parichan, you have Pamburugashin, all these protected areas. If you have access to a 4x4, I would recommend, if the conditions aren't too deteriorated, that you go out and just try and explore these protected areas. Take photographs, report back, see what's happening inside. Otherwise, without people actually going and visiting, nobody knows what's happening inside, and that's another disaster in itself.
That's the other important thing, that along with managed visitation, it does create that extra bit of protection, because when there are people going and visiting these places, all these illegal activities cannot happen.
Exactly.
Or
it's very difficult.
More of a fear for these illegal activities to happen, because there's chance of getting caught as such.
Exactly. So
visitation is important, but then again, you don't want it to get bad to a level where it's over-visited also.
Well, that comes in with the principles of sustainable development and sustainability for ecosystems.
But exactly, putting in the right management plans, yeah?
Yeah, that is also true.
Yeah, so it becomes interesting, and especially in this area. Talking about this area, I think, is key, because there is so much in this area to be offered, but you can't expect what you would in other areas. Yeah. And I mean, there are leopards, bear, and all of that can be found, but they're not as habituated, and you can't go expecting an experience like in Yala Block 1 or Wilpattu or something like that. But for nature lovers, I would say it's more about the nature and exploring Sri Lanka as a whole. That would be more important, because Laugala is a beautiful area. Just some of those reservoirs that can be found within Lahugala Kitulana, and even lots of these reservoirs in this area are really beautiful places just to go and sit and enjoy. But you can't expect too much wildlife, is what I'm saying. You can't go with big expectations, but just the love for nature as such. What would you think on that point?
No, absolutely. It comes down to how much you are willing to put the time in and contribute towards ensuring that these protected areas, remain on the radar, as it were. Because also keep in mind that some of these protected areas, now example, Lahugala Kitulana National Park is a protected water catchment area as well for the Lahugala Kitulana and Sengamua reservoirs. Even Madroya, a good 30 square kilometers of that national park or more, is under 5 reservoirs. Madroya, NDK, Heina Negla, Ulhitia, Ratkinda. All of these contribute either directly or indirectly to the survival of the people living on the peripheries of these protected areas. So there's the component of ecotourism, which has to be managed responsibly, and the component of ensuring that people's livelihoods aren't threatened either. Because if we lose the protected areas, a lot of people will lose their livelihoods as well. It all ties in. There's a huge aspect of that.
I think we did mention that when we were over on the west, where there is that connectivity and web in all the, even the smallest impact can send shudders down the web.
Yeah.
Again, it comes down to the management structure and how we do manage things. So it is important to get together with the government and all these NGOs to come together, I would say, and that's what we've been talking about throughout these protected area awareness sessions, the importance of the togetherness and people being aware and wanting to do more. And that's where that going and exploring these places and enjoying the nature in itself being important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's actually something we can touch on next time as well when we do our 4th session next time on the protected areas in the Central Highlands. There will be multiple examples, including of which Riahn has experience, working in the Central Highlands, where non-governmental organizations or national environmental organizations actually directly contribute to ensuring that human-wildlife conflict is kept to a minimal level in the Central Highlands. But that will be for next time's session.
Yeah. But even within this area, then again, there is the human-animal conflict that is happening. And again, it comes down to where these roads are and all that. And that's where what we were talking about earlier, the management of how people move along these roads and where the settlements do come in. And all of that ties into just, in the end, we blame the animals, but that's what happens. Unfortunately, that's the sad reality of it. We do blame the animals, but in the end, it's us going and doing things without the knowledge of proper management plan that do impact. And what would you say? I'm trying to put this in the right way.
I guess I would say, if I was to wrap it up in that sense, it would be proper protected area planning, ensuring that industrial and urban development does not encroach too much into the existing network, and manage
also all this overlap and all that. So it's getting the 2 departments to work together in a proper managed way that creates this link, and having that link not fought over between the departments, and they have more interaction that goes for positive change than just trying to put boundaries in and say, this is ours, this is mine. That is where we need to really effect change, is what I would think.
Exactly. Because this whole mine and yours attitude, now, for example, even in the Somawathiya National Park region, there's actually quite a bit of overlap with existing Department of Forest Conservation protected areas, such as Mahaveli Ganga North and South. So we need to find a way to ensure that these protected areas aren't sliced off from each other. Because imagine putting electric fencing through DWC and DFC protected areas, you're defeating the whole point of ensuring that connectivity. So it comes down to responsible protected area management, ultimately, I think.
Yeah, exactly. That responsible protected area management, I would say, is the key term as such. But again, there are so many other things that do come into play, unfortunately. And it is that management plan, how we implement it. So it's towards, and like I was saying earlier, this is probably the best time for us to improve these management plans, because you can do it while there's no one going into these national parks. You can go back to the drawing board as such and create different maps and come up with plans of how you would implement change, because all these roads we were talking about are not being used. So finding out where animals are now using it probably more to cross into other protected areas that across these roads. Just studying behavior patterns probably now is the best time while the human aspect is away from everything else. But then again, when the human aspect does come into play, it doesn't mean you go back to the old practices. You try to implement these new practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that sense, we can create a protected area network that actually rivals and mirrors the principles of sustainable protected area management and responsibility, and at the same time ensure that people directly and indirectly benefit from protected areas. Because without that financial component, these protected areas aren't likely to survive. Even the national parks themselves are under threat unless they provide a financial component for the people and the communities living around them.
Definitely. Anyway, next week we'll be talking about the Central Highlands, which is another interesting topic in itself. There's so much biodiversity within the Central Hills of Sri Lanka that people probably don't know about, because when you do talk about the Central Hills, people think of probably Adams Peak, Horton Plains, and then into further down towards Randenigala and all of that.
Yeah, but there is a lot more. As far as protected areas are concerned in the Central Highlands, well, I won't spoil it for now, but there are an incredible amount. In fact, it actually makes even the protected area numbers in the Lowland wet zone look positively trivial based on the number of connecting strands, whether they're in proposed or existing status, for the protected areas in the Central Highlands themselves. But we will talk about that further next time.
And to wrap up this session, I would say it is important for the management plans and more awareness to be created about these zones, because it is probably a zone with a lot of coverage in terms of protected areas, but people do not know about it. And the things that are happening within it happen because of the fact that there isn't as much awareness. So that is one thing. Maybe people now, after this session, people can go and visit some of these national parks and other protected areas in this zone and create that awareness and create that love for nature in this zone.
Absolutely. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, if you have the opportunity, I would say, as one last point, put any examples of protected areas that you drive through, go on safari in, or just generally are keen to explore. Take all safety precautions as per the need, but use that on social media, Facebook, Instagram. Use that to spread the word that these protected areas represent the last true great wildernesses on this island. And it's something that we should strive to protect as a responsible community and even amongst the wildlife enthusiasts. And I hope that these sessions will encourage people to get out there and explore more. Even when going to the East Coast, stop off every so often. Go and visit a protected area that you know nothing about or have only heard something about. That way, at least, we can spread the word and we can keep these protected areas safe for future generations.
Exactly. We have a quick question up there. Any initiative taken to educate the provincial authorities? Again, dealing with the authorities and coming up with the right management structure, that's where we have to be careful in the way we say things. It is important, and our departments working together and all of that does need to be improved, but it can happen, and there is initiative for it to happen. What would you think on that point that has been brought up?
I honestly think there is quite a bit of scope. I think if we were to organize DWC and DFC sessions with the UVA Provincial Council authorities, we could actually spread further awareness amongst communities who might not necessarily even be aware of what we're talking about. In that sense, communities who don't have direct access to social media and who aren't aware of what's happening from a Colombo standpoint, those communities have quite a bit of scope if we work with the provincial authorities. Now, that will then require a lot of discussion, obviously, and a little bit of bureaucratic finagling, but I still think there is scope for it, absolutely. And thank you for the question.
No, the definite scope. And again, like you said, in that point, you mentioned the Colombo standpoint. You have to probably go and be in these areas and study these areas and come up with a proper plan. You can't just from Colombo think of something and implement it, because it's very different on the ground and how you deal with authorities in those areas and the different departments. Because while Colombo has the DFC and DWC head offices and all of that, on the ground, the beat officers and all of the other aspects in those areas probably work different to what is happening in Colombo. So coming up with plans that work in those areas. So it has to be more specific as such. So there's all that has ties into it. So it's not an easy thing that can be done overnight as such.
But there is still potential for it. If we work to a 5-year, 10-year plan, then I think something can be done, even in that.
I'm not saying there isn't potential. I'm saying more the fact that you have to be on the ground in those areas to come up with a better strategy.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Anyway, we'll end that there, and we'll be talking about the Central Highlands.
Yeah. So thank you very much to everybody who tuned in, and we will see you next time for session 4 on the Central Highlands of Sri Lanka and its protected areas. Till next time.
All right. See you.